young man right here asked me if I was American. I said yes. And I'm a Yankee fan, so you're sitting there with that Cleveland Indians hat. You're asking for trouble over there. But aside from that, we're going to talk about drugs today. I thought I'd talk for about 45 minutes. Maybe you could just let me talk unless there's something you don't understand. But then after 45 minutes, maybe we'll take a 15-minute break or something. And then after that, we'll have discussion. But let's not have anyone else holding their own lecture. I'm the only lecturer here today. So the discussion is, just get to the point, a couple of sentences at the most, and let someone else have a chance to talk also. And if we run out of discussions, then I'll just keep lecturing after that. So you'll get your 2 hours worth. As I said, I was born in America. I came to Sweden when I was 20 years old. I was a student in Uppsala. And I was absolutely shocked at the way Swedes deal with alcohol. Not my cup of tea, if I put it to you that way. And Sweden has a very special relationship to drugs, and that's just in general, and it grows out of this way of dealing with alcohol, but I'm not going to get into that tonight. Otherwise, just as a way of introduction, I'm a professor of sociology, and have been teaching at different universities here in Sweden for a very long time. All right, then we'll just get to it. This is the name of a book I published a few months ago. This is the way it looks like for real. And I have a few copies with me if anyone's interested, and you can come up during the break and talk to me about it. All right, the title for today's lecture subject. I just have to find the page down button and see if that will is the international legalization debate. And I wish I could have written the Swedish legalization debate, but there is no Swedish legalization debate, so I can't really talk about that. And that in itself is rather strange because the whole rest of the world is talking about legalization now. But I'm not going to get into why Sweden isn't. I'm just going to present some of the ideas that are in the international debate, and then I'm going to give examples of the international debate with things about Sweden. I'm going to use Sweden as an example as much as possible to show you the points being made in the international debate. When it comes to the question period after these 45 minutes, if any of you are having trouble speaking English or a little shy about it or just whatever, you can ask the questions in Swedish and we'll just translate it. So anyone who has something to say shouldn't feel that, hey, I can't say it because it's in English. All right, then let's just get going. The first thing I'm going to talk about is a little bit about drug-related harms. And I would say that I would like to start off by saying that one of the reasons why narcotic drugs are illegal is because they're potentially dangerous. And the fact that I've written a book about possibly legalizing narcotics is not to say that I'm not aware of the fact that narcotics are potentially dangerous. That is, they can be used in a dangerous way. So to discuss legalization does not necessarily mean that you think that, oh, there's no problems with legalization. There's lots of problems. So what we're basically going to be getting down to is, well, if it's put it to this way, is that raising the question of legalization or decriminalization. Can I ask you, do you guys know the difference, or should I? Are those two terms familiar? Somebody over there does it. All right. Legalization simply means that you take drugs out of the law books. You just simply say, you take it out of, we have something in Swedish called narkotikastrafflagen, which I don't quite know how to translate into English. Does anyone know what it is in English? How many law students here? Well, narkotikastrafflagen is sort of it's the law about narcotics, and it's a criminal law. And when we're talking about legalization, you're saying we're going to take narcotics out of the criminal law. And and that would be against the United Nations conventions. And that's the reason why no country in the world has legalized, legalize narcotics. But a lot of countries and states have. And the reason why no country in the world has legalized narcotics. But a lot of countries and states have. And the reason why no country in the world has legalized narcotics. But a lot of countries and states have. And the reason why no country in the world has legalized narcotics. But a lot of countries and states started to decriminalize. And what decriminalize means is that it's still against the law, but we're not reacting to it. We're not reacting to people who break the law in the same way. We're not putting them in prison. We're not giving them a criminal record, but we're doing something else. And maybe we'll say a few things about what that something else can be. It depends on how the discussion is. So, the question that's being raised in the international legalization debate is not whether drugs are unharmful. What the question is prohibition, the kind of drug policy which we now have, are they more harmful than legalization? So what I'm basically saying is that any drug policy you have will have negative consequences, at least for some people. The current drug policy we have, prohibition, is very harmful for some people. But maybe it's very good for others. And the same thing will happen with legalization or decriminalization. I'll probably just use the word legalization, but when I use it, I mean one or some form of legalization or decriminalization. It's just a pain to have to say both words all the time. But by talking about legalization, what we're basically saying is that, yeah, some people are going to suffer if we legalize. Absolutely. But the question is, will the total suffering be more or less than we have right now? And that's a big problem here in Sweden, is that people are not willing to discuss the suffering that our own drug policies cause. They're not willing to take a good hard look at prohibition and say, hey, this is hurting people. And that's what's happening in the rest of the world. The rest of the world is saying prohibition is hurting people. And that's why they say we have to do something else. And to be honest with you, if you remember the title of the book, which I had up there for such a long time, it said legalize narcotics with a question mark after it. Not an explanation point, a question mark. Because I frankly don't know if it's better to legalize or to keep the policies we have. I just want to discuss it. I want to make people aware of the problems we have with the policies we have now. Well, who knows? Maybe at the end of the discussion we're going to say it's still the best way to go. But let's discuss the options first. And that's something we have not been doing in Sweden. Okay. So, what we must do, quite simply, is to weigh different kinds of damages against one another. If we have one policy, who gets hurt, what kind of damages? If we change, who gets hurt by that, what kind of damages? What is the one that causes the least problems? That's basically what it's all about. So, tonight I'm going to spend all the time I have talking about what's wrong with prohibition. So this is not going to be any kind of nuanced discussion on one hand. On the other hand, this is very one-sided because the discussion in Sweden is very one-sided, and now I have a few minutes. I only have 45 minutes. I want to present the other side. Okay, we're going to start with the United Nations, though. The United Nations, which is, sponsors the policies in the whole world, and the United Nations has a prohibitionistic policy just like Sweden. There's a discussion within the United Nations about decriminalization. And some of the points being made, the INCB is the International Narcotics Control Board. Now, it's an independent, quasi-legal organization that its job is to see that countries follow the 3 narcotics conventions, the 3 United Nations narcotics conventions. Do all of you know about them, the single convention? Do you know about the 3 conventions? Well, I'm afraid I can't get into it now, but there's three narcotics conventions that the United Nations has organized. They've been signed by almost every country in the world. And the INCB, Sweden of course is one of them. And the INCB, it's their job to see that every country follows them. And the INCB is always pointing fingers at different countries about not following. And But okay. The United Nations Office on Drugs and Crimes, UNODC, I'm just going to call it UNODC in the future. That is an organization within the United Nations. And what they say is that, yeah, according to the conventions that everybody signed, it is absolutely necessary to have laws on the books forbidding possession of narcotics. So every country who has signed those conventions has laws on the books forbidding narcotics. But at the same time, INCB writes, and here's a little quote, "The practice of exempting small quantities of drugs from criminal prosecution is consistent with the international drug control treaties." Read that one more time. Just take a look at it. What they're saying is then, is yes, it's against the law to possess narcotics, but if you have small quantities, it should be permitted to be exempted from prosecution. Now, that is what people are talking about decriminalization are saying. Decriminalization says keep the laws on the book, but don't enforce them. And that's what the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime is also saying. And that's certainly a far cry from the situation here in Sweden. But it didn't always used to be this way. There was a period in Sweden from when we started with the modern narcotics problem, maybe in 1965 until 1979, where we accepted something called åtalsunderlåtelse. Those of you who are Swedish, you know that word, åtalsunderlåtelse? But it means that prosecutors have a right not to prosecute. They don't have to prosecute every case. So, and that was the case until 1979, that it was the prosecutor's judgment to say, is this a serious enough crime? Does the person have enough drugs on them, or they sold enough, or whatever it is, to make it worth prosecuting them? And in the period up to 1979, a lot of people caught with drugs on them were not prosecuted, and that's decriminalization. But then, in 1979, the general prosecutor, the main prosecutor, sent a circular letter to all the other prosecutors and said, no more åtalsunderlåtelse. Everybody gets prosecuted. Now, there are some signs right now that this is changing. Amongst other things, the Supreme Court in Sweden, that's the Högsta domstol in Sweden, has started cracking down on the excessive amounts of penalties being given to people on drugs. And the Supreme Court is reversing decisions in the lower courts. So we're starting to see changes here in Sweden also. Okay, in several other countries, such as the Netherlands, Portugal, and Switzerland, exemption from prosecution is the rule, not the exception. In Sweden, if it happens, it's a huge exception. But in several countries where they decriminalize, what they're basically saying is, it's against the law to have small quantities of drugs on you, but if you have them, nothing's going to happen. So it's sort of like a quasi-legalization. Now, the Netherlands was the first country to start doing this. They started doing it already in the 1960s. And the INCB, you remember them, the ones who were watching the conventions for the United Nations, they were cracking down on the Netherlands all the time. Now, all of a sudden, as more and more countries are following the Dutch model, the INCB has stopped cracking down on them because they can't crack down on everybody. So, without using the term decriminalization, because that's a little too politically radical for the UNODC, it says, and I'll just read this quote to you, between 1.25% of the population of many countries in Europe and North America has been in possession of illicit drugs. And this is the quote. Most remain productive citizens. In only a small share of these cases would arrest and the lifelong stigma it brings be appropriate. And this is the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime basically say that we can't be prosecuting people for small amounts of drugs. But in Sweden, we may not prosecute and send them to prison, but there are other sanctions being raised against them. In Sweden, we still believe in the drug-free society. Furthermore, the UNODC speaks favorably of Portuguese drug policy. And what Portugal has done is they have decriminalized all drugs, not just cannabis, which is the question in most countries. All drugs, heroin, cocaine, you name it, they're all decriminalized. And have been since 2001. So that's over 10 years ago. Now, how can the United Nations drug organ go out and praise Portugal? Because it's very simple. They've seen the statistics. Portugal was one of the worst countries in Europe as far as the number of people on drugs and the drug deaths and HIV and the whole business. But after they decriminalized, everything got turned around. Portugal is one of the best countries in the world. Because they are now using the money they used to use in the courts and in the prisons for care. We'll get back to that, what we're using money for, in a little while. Okay, everybody following me? Okay. Anyhow, to legalize narcotics, a country would have to reject the UN drug conventions. Nobody has chosen to legalize drugs. However, Bolivia has withdrawn from the UN conventions because they have a long tradition, not of cocaine, but of chewing coca. Coca is a leaf of a plant. And they've been doing it for 5,000 years. It's their tradition. And the UN drug conventions consider coca to be the same as cocaine, with the same penalties. And the Bolivians said, I'm sorry, but we can't have a whole country doing things illegal. So they applied to get coca leaf in Bolivia to be exempted, and 15 countries of the 178 who signed the convention, 15 said no. Guess which country was one of the 15? Yeah, the US was one, that's right. But Sweden was also one, of course. All right, so anyway, what I would say though is that there are many countries and states in the US and Australia that have chosen to decriminalize instead of legalize. And what you can see, I'm sure you've been reading something about medical marijuana or medical cannabis. That's sort of a form of decriminalization. Okay, well, before we go on, I just want to say there are disadvantages to decriminalization. So it's not like, hey, we're just going to decriminalize and everything's going to be honky-dory. Well, it's not. So some of the problems, I'll just mention a few. You guys said you're not lawyers, but I'll use a few lawyer terms for you. De jure and de facto are no longer the same. De jure is law on the books. De facto is law as it's applied. Now, normally, you apply the law such as it is on the books, right? That's the normal state of things. But decriminalization means that you have one law on the books and you have another praxis in what you're actually doing. So de facto is what you're actually doing. What you're actually doing is not what the law book says you should be doing. So that can be a problem for some people because it creates illegal uncertainty, because we have laws that are not being enforced. And that would probably have an effect, at least on some people's sense of justice. They think that if there's a law, you should follow it. I think most of us think that. Is that right? Do you guys think you should follow the law, or you just think everybody does whatever they feel like? I think I'll go back to driving on the left side of the road. Sweden used to drive on the left. Maybe I think I should do that too. bothered with all these laws about staying to the right. Okay, another problem is, and this is maybe not such a serious one in Sweden, but in a lot of other countries, and that is when you have laws on the books that are not really being enforced, but they're being selectively enforced. That means that a government can use laws to get rid of people they want to get rid of. So let's just say we should decide that cannabis is decriminalized. So everybody's smoking, everyone who wants to is smoking. So you might get someone who's politically uncomfortable for the current government, who's smoking, and then they'll just arrest him for smoking. He's breaking the law. So when you're not following the law in a logical manner, it means that the law can be selectively applied to opponents to the government. And that is dangerous. Okay, I was going to leave the United Nations and get on to something else, and that is looking at prohibition. Have you guys heard that word, prohibition? Prohibition comes from the English word to prohibit, forbidden. And that's the word that was used for when alcohol was forbidden in the U.S., when alcohol was illegal in the U.S. from 1919 to 1932. You remember Al Capone? That's where he was making his money. And yeah, that was called prohibition, called förbud, tiden in Swedish. And what prohibition simply means is that possession of substances on a certain list are illegal, is illegal. It's forbidden. All right, and that's basic. That's the basis of Swedish drug policy. All right, so now I'm going to take some of the arguments against prohibition. The first one is that one of the mainstays, especially in the United Nations form of prohibition, is to stop production. We're going to stop countries from producing drugs. And the only trouble is that all the international efforts we've made so far have failed. If we manage to stop production in one place, which has happened, it simply moves to somewhere else. So like you probably know that Afghanistan is the biggest producer of opiates in the world. It didn't used to be that way. It used to be the Golden Triangle, which was Laos, Cambodia, and Burma, or Myanmar, you maybe call it. But when the crackdowns came in the Golden Triangle, it just moved to Afghanistan. And then actually it was the Taliban who, for 1 year, clamped down on production in Afghanistan, so it just moved across the border to Pakistan. And then when the crackdown stopped in Afghanistan, it moved back again. It's what in English is called push down, pop up. You guys ever play a game like a Gurn or Lund or something? You have these things that pop up. You have like hammers in your hand, and you hit this one here, and it jumps up over there, and you hit that one. You guys ever play that game? Well, that's what this is. You hit it here, and it comes up there. You hit it there, and it comes up somewhere else. And I've been doing some field studies for a long time. I was 4 years living on the streets in Stockholm with drug addicts, and I could see that very well. Because if we were hanging out in one place, like in Kungsträdgården in Stockholm, and the police started cracking down, so we moved over to Humlegården, and then they cracked down on that, so you moved down to Snätorget, so Sergels Torg. And so sure, you can move people around and you can get them away from a place for a little while, but they don't disappear. So okay, we can't stop production. And one of the reasons why we can't, just to give you a little bit of a better explanation, it's like when you live in Sweden, you always think like the government has control over the country, which is true in Sweden. The government does have control over the country. But there's lots of places in the world where the government does not have control over the whole country. They might only have control over the capital city and a few square kilometers outside of it, but that's it. But you have all these drug lords or warlords or chieftains or we used to have that in Sweden also. Do you guys know the word jarl in Swedish? You know, there was a Jarl in every Vik in Scandinavia. You know, you travel like 10 kilometers up the coast, and there was someone else who was the big honcho. So, I mean, Sweden went through a centralization process, under Gustav Vasa, by the way. And, but before that, Sweden was like a lot of countries are today. You have a central government that doesn't have control over the periphery. And these warlords out in the periphery, and you see it so very clearly in Afghanistan, for instance, they need money to keep themselves armed. So where are they going to get the money from? Well, it's not going to be from selling soybeans, I'll tell you that. Okay. The next thing we can't stop is smuggling. You know, there was a period here in Sweden when the different parties were like bidding over each other. Who was toughest on drugs, and who was giving most money to the police, and who was giving most money to the customs. Well, okay. We've been trying to stop drugs from coming into the country since 1960s. But the thing is, there are very strong economic incentives to smuggle drugs. And you guys study economy? Yeah. So you know all about incentives, right? When the incentives are high enough, then people do things. And you can make a lot of money selling drugs. There are a few risks involved, of course, but you can make a lot of money. More than I've ever made, that's for sure. And another little problem is there's just too many ingenious methods for smuggling drugs to ever stop it. So I'll just take one example to help you out. You know, Sweden has a rather long coastline, like 2,960 kilometers. And it's just full of, I don't know the English word, Goldberg. What's that in English? It's,
Islets.
what?
Islets?
Yeah, small islands and places where the water isn't very deep. And so the method you use is you sail a boat up here full of drugs in international water, and somewhere off the Swedish coast you just dump them overboard. Now we have very good navigational equipment nowadays. I myself have been a pilot for a long time, and I can tell you that modern GPSs will get you within 3 meters of where you want to go anywhere in the world. 3 meters. And if you're 3 meters close to an airport, you usually can find it. And if you're 3 meters close to some drugs on the bottom of the ocean, you can find them too. So there's even a word for it in English. The guys who swim out there, what you do is, you know, Sweden has a lot of sailboats, and we have a lot of small pleasure boats in this country, right? So you go out on a Sunday afternoon in the summer, there's all kinds of boats out there, right? So you sail out in your little boat, and you have, since it's not very deep, you have a snorkel with you. Nobody gets suspicious if you have a snorkel, right? And you jump overboard, you pick them up, and you put it on your boat. And then, when everybody else is sailing back in the late afternoon, you sail back with them. So who's going to stop you? You think the customs, they're going to search every stinking little boat that comes out? You come there with your 4-meter boat. Hey, I got to look on what you got on your boat. Ah, you're smuggling father of the cord, eh? No, but so basically, it's completely impossible to stop smuggling. I'll give you one more ingenious thing. They've managed to turn cocaine paste into something that looks like cardboard, like cardboard boxes. So they actually ship this stuff to Sweden in what looks like a box. And of course the customs, they're looking inside the box, finding whatever. And then you just add the right chemicals, and then the box turns into cocaine. But okay. I can just see the customs licking every box just to make sure. But after a while, they're going to be too high to do anything about it. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Just, what? What's that? Yeah, we can have the dogs doing it. But, you know, the fact is, there's just too many, there's too many ports of entry, there aren't enough dogs, and if you ever get enough dogs, so we'll stop doing that, we'll do something else. That's the point. And, you know, just like in the U.S., they make so much money from smuggling drugs into the U.S. that these guys would fly in on airplanes, like private airplanes, and these airplanes might cost $1 million to buy. That's like 8 million crowns or 7 million crowns. When they land them, they just leave them. They just land them somewhere on a small aircraft and leave them. Because the profits are so high, they can walk away from $1 million airplane. Okay. The last thing we can't stop is the dealers. Now, why can't we stop the dealers? Well, once again, incentives and things like that, but I'm not going to get into that. I'll just say that between 1980 and 2009, that's a 30-year period, Sweden increased the number of police working on drug cases by 450%. During that entire period, the supply of drugs in Sweden increased. So it doesn't seem to matter how many police we put on drug cases, the amount of drugs in the country just increases and increases. There are those people who believe that Sweden is now self-supporting about cannabis. We grow as much cannabis in the country as we consume. We don't have to smuggle it in anymore. And of course, we have amphetamine labs, and if it gets too hard to smuggle, it's not that hard to make other drugs. And just as a last little thing, I would say we can't even keep our prisons drug-free. So if we can't keep the prisons drug-free, how are we going to keep the whole country drug-free? And the answer is we aren't, and we can't. So basically, the three major tenets of prohibition, stop production, stop smuggling, and stop dealing, none of them work. Okay. Now we'll go over to we'll leave the supply side and go over to the demand side. Those of you who are in economics, you know about supply and demand. So we're going to have a supply here no matter what we do. So let's take a look at the demand side, because if no one's asking for the product, then there's no reason to bring it in, right? Okay. And the reason I'm using the year 1980 as a starting point is that's basically the starting point of the current Swedish drug policy, the so-called Swedish model. As I already told you, 1979 was when we stopped with åtalseftergift, åtalsunderlåtelse. And that was one of the very first parts of the Swedish model. But the Swedish model, after 30 years, we have almost twice as many what I call problematic consumers, you might call them heavy abusers. We have twice as many now as we had when we started. Furthermore, in spite of all the efforts, and I already told you we've increased the number of police working on this by 450%, in spite of all the resources and all the efforts we put into it, the price of drugs has gone down almost continuously during these 30 years. And if the price is going down, that means that there's a greater supply than demand. And not only is the price going down, the products being sold are more pure. I don't know if you guys know, but drugs are normally diluted. Utsped in Swedish. And of course, if there's no one else in town selling except for you, then you can dilute and get it sold anyway. But if somebody else is selling something better, then you're not going to get yours sold. And that's the whole point. There are too many people selling, there's too many drugs, you can't dilute it the same way as used to. So, we've got more drugs in the country, the price is going down, and they're pure. And furthermore, when I first started in this business, people used to come to Stockholm from we call it the provinces. That's Linköping, in case you know that. And you used to come up to Stockholm from places like Linköping and buy in Stockholm and then bring them home and sell in their hometowns. It's not that way anymore. You don't have to go to Stockholm to buy drugs. You buy them right here in Linköping, or in Norrköping, or in Gävle, or wherever. So it's not only there are more drugs, cheaper and purer, they're all over the place. Okay, everybody still following me? I haven't put you to sleep yet? Okay. Try to keep you awake for a few more minutes. Okay, prohibition has a load of disadvantages. One is crime. First of all, the very fact that drugs are illegal means that otherwise law-abiding and non-violent citizens, who knows, maybe some of you like to smoke a joint on Saturday night or something, you're breaking the law. So if we arrest you and give you a sentence, of course that's going to affect you for the rest of your life. And prohibition does that. As long as you're sort of enforcing prohibition, it makes otherwise law-abiding citizens into criminals. And if you're one of those guys who smokes cannabis on a Saturday night or something, you're not alone. There are about 1 million people in Sweden who have tried at least, who have used illegal drugs at least once. Now, if you're going to put all those million in prison, it's going to get crowded, isn't it? And I don't want to think about how I'm going to have to raise the taxes to pay for that. All right. I know some of you guys don't like to pay taxes. I'm not all that against paying taxes, but I know some of you don't like that. Okay. Furthermore, when you have illegal drugs and you're clamping down on it, it usually raises the prices. When it raises the prices, it means that those who are problematic consumers, not guys like you who smoke a joint once in a while, but people using it every day, where are they going to get the money to pay for it? Well, they either have to commit crimes or become prostitutes, or both. Now, it's not illegal to be a prostitute, but it is illegal to buy sex. So, even if the prostitute isn't doing anything illegal, his or her customers are. So we're increasing the crime rate. Then there's a matter of corruption, and this is something that's really a big problem in a lot of other countries. Sweden has been probably the country who has the best reputation for not being corrupt. However, I happen to live in a town called Solna. Okay, I guess some of you have heard about my hometown. But there's going to be a soccer arena in the national arena in Solna. It's just that the head of our kommunstyrelsen and the head tjänsteman in Solna are now on trial for corruption in connection with the national arena. And of course you also heard about Goldberg, where there are a few people with their fingers in the cookie jar. So even if Sweden has a really good reputation internationally, we're not immune to it. And my point is that people who, in the drug business, who are making a lot of money, they can use that money, and they do in a lot of other countries, they use that money to lower their risks. And they do that by bribing the police, customs, judges, politicians, members of the press, everybody. And so, as I said, we now are discovering a little bit of corruption in Swedish municipalities, and if that's an indication that there's becoming a greater acceptance for bribes, well, guess who has the money to do the bribing? Prohibition also contributed to our choosing the wrong priorities. So we look at the priorities we have in Sweden today. The money we spend on drug policy, 75% goes to the judicial system. The judicial system, that's the police, that's the courts,